So may the Spirit of God dwell in this place and in our midst. Today's passage is from 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. So we have been meditating this chapter a couple of weeks before, but as we had a Good Friday and Easter service, so we meditated on Jesus' passion, death and resurrection. And here we are again coming to the same chapter from where we have stopped. And here we are. So I believe that the Word of God will speak to us this morning as we turn our hearts to hear God's Word. And let us all turn our Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 31 to 33. I kindly request somebody to read the verse. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 31 to 33. Verse 1 tells us that what David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for David. Saul sent for him. So we see David's words were reported to Saul, and we know that Saul was the king of Israel and he ruled the people of Israel. And immediately Saul, the king of Israel, sent for David and called him. So what David spoke there, and so that it reached the king of Israel. So there should be something serious about what was spoken by David. So we will see what happened before that. So when we look at the background of this, we see that one day early in the morning, David just kept his flock, his sheep to other shepherd, and he just took up, he loaded the grains and the other eatables, grains, other things for his brothers. And father of David was Jesse, and Jesse instructed him and directed him that you should take this and that. So you need to give this food to this brother, and the other stuffs to the other heads and the in charge. So this David takes everything in a bag or in a sack, anything, and he just moved out of his home, and he was going to the battle lines. So as he was going to the battle lines, because his brothers were in the army, so they were in the army of Saul, so that they were busy in camping, putting a camp in a hill. So we see that that season was a battle season of battle and season of war, and war cries were coming out as David entered the place. So Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines facing each other. And as they were facing line each other, David left his things with the keeper of supplies and ran to the battle lines and asked his brothers how they were and how they are doing, whether fine, good, okay or not. And we see, as David was talking to his brothers, a champion named Goliath from Gath, he stepped forward. As we have meditated the previous weeks, we know that he stepped out of his line and he threatened the people of Israel, and he shouted his defiance, and not only that, his words were very harsh and ruthless, and all these things were going on. And the other hand, David was hearing every word of Goliath. So whenever the Israelites saw the man, the Goliath, they all fled for him in fear. They all fled away. And now the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this person, this Goliath, keeps on coming out, and he defies the armies of Israel. And they were busy talking that the king will surely give a great wealth and a prize and award for the person who kills that great giant. And they were busy talking and discussing that what will the king Saul give to the person who defeats that giant. He will surely marry his daughter to that person. And not only that, the king will exempt the person who defeats that Goliath from all the taxes. So it's kind of tax-free option for that person who defeats that giant. And we see that as these things were on discuss at that place, David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills the Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel?" So he was very concerned. We see the next line that David told, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So David's pressure started to rise, to increase, because he heard defiling words that an unknown person is just pouring out rash words about the armies of the living God. So as David asked these questions, the people around him replied to him saying, this is what will happen who kills that person. And we see at last Eliab, David's oldest brother, he just steps in and hears that words that David spoke to the other people, and he burned with anger, it seems. And the verses also tell that he burnt with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? So what is the necessary? So for what purpose you have come all the way from Bethlehem to this place, to the battlefield?" And he also scolds David that, "I know you are a deceitful person, and I know your heart is a wicked thing. You came down only to watch the battle." So all these harsh words and all these very stressful words was heard by David, but David, he did not do anything at that place. He just asked question, "What I have done? I haven't done anything wrong or anything that is very offending other people." So he just turned away and started to talk, to ask questions as like before. So, and the men around him also answered him back as like before. So this is what the background of what was happened. And the main incident to look at is verse 26. In chapter 17, verse 26 is the main incident to look at. And only there we see how David spoke and what all he told. So this 26th verse is the most important incident to look at, because we see these words of David which he spoke there was reported to the king of Israel, to Saul. Here we see David asks two important questions: for what he is there, and who is this uncircumcised? So he starts with what and who. So Saul must have reacted differently because of David's words. So Saul must have reacted very differently because of the report that he got from the other people. So Saul must have felt embarrassed, confused and shocked, because no one in that place spoke like David spoke. So Saul must have thought that, is that fellow kidding? And does he know the seriousness of what he had spoken there? So does that David know how much serious is that to talk like that? And he must have thought like, bring me that David, so that I want to speak to that person. I want to talk to him right now. And this is not that Saul did not know who David was. Saul knew David before itself. Because in 1 Samuel 16th chapter, the previous chapter, Saul's spirit was disturbed, and he got a disturbing spirit from the Lord, because Saul did not obey the commandments, the words of the Lord. So the Lord gave Saul into the hands of the disturbing spirits. And we see this disturbing spirit just stirred up Saul day by day. He tortured Saul day by day. And Saul was in a great need of instrument, someone to play music and to heal him through the music. And he told to the other person and to his servant, one of his servants, and his servant told that, I know a person who fears God, and also he plays music, the harp, the lyre very well, and he's a very good person. So Saul sent message to Jesse. So Jesse was the father of David, as we all know. So this king of Israel, when he is disturbed by his spirit, he is in a great need of a musician to play and to heal his bad spirit, to bad moment. And one of the servants of Saul just recommended David, and a king is now sending a message to David's father, telling that, please send your son David here so that he will play music for me and the other things, and I will get relief and other thing. So Saul was in a very stressful moment, and as David came and reached there, we all know that David played the harp, and the bad spirit that was in Saul, it just through Saul's spirit and Saul's heart, it just shook his spirit and body, and he felt uncomfortable. But as soon as David started to play the instrument and sing and worship the Lord, that spirit went away from Saul's body. So Saul was healed whenever David could play the instrument. And we see that, so Saul very well knew David, but now he calls him, not that Saul doesn't know who David was, but because to meet David for what he had told in the midst of the Israelites. So that was the reason. So we see now, after all these things, all these incidents took place, David was asked to meet the king of Israel. So after everything happened, and every question that David spoke, every incident happened, and now he is called to visit, to meet the king of Israel. Now David goes to meet Saul, enters his place, and stands before the king of Israel. Next we see verse 32. We see David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. So look at the boldness of David. David standing in front of Saul, the king of Israel, and he did not fear him. He did not have any struggles to face that king, but was the first one to talk. Saul was the one who wanted to meet David, so he was the first one to call David. So David did not tell anybody that give me permission to meet the king. King himself wants to talk with David, and he wanted to talk with David. So the first call was from the side of Saul. And so who should have started the conversation first? A king calls David, a person, and here we see David speaking instead of Saul speaking first. So who should have started the conversation first? It should have been Saul who should have started the conversation, because he was the one who sent and called David to his place. So, but we see David is now starting up the conversation. He talks first. David had no fear of Saul. He had no fear that he would scold him for his words, or he did not have any fear of anyone in that place. And we see David was very bold enough here, and also David was very much faithful in God. So David had two important things here. Number one is boldness, and number two is faith. Look how much faith David would have had while standing in front of Saul. Just keep that running through your mind. Saul had everything. He had a great army, a number of weapons, etc. But David, without having any of this, is bold enough and very much faithful in God than Saul. Surprising to look at this incident. We see David at the peak of his faith and boldness had a great struggle and obstacle which was ahead of him. So, as David was very much stronger in his faith and he was very much bold enough, so when he was in a good state of holding the faith, his faith and boldness, suddenly a great struggle and obstacle was standing in front of David. We see what happens and what happened next. Verse 33 we see, Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man and he has a warrior from his youth." Here comes the word of discouragement by Saul to David. So here is where a great trouble, a great struggle comes to David through Saul. As we saw that David had much faith and boldness, and when he was still holding them strongly, this words of discouragement hits David. Among the whole Israelites, we see not even a single person had such a faith and boldness that David had. So we cannot see a single person like David in that whole congregation or the whole assembly or the whole country. So no king or no people, no soldier, anyone, not a single person had a faith or bold words. But because the reason is because that they saw Goliath and were afraid of him as well as afraid of his words. But David was a different kind of person among all. You see, yes, of course, Saul's words were a discouragement to David. But the interesting thing here is that David did not get discouraged by Saul's word. You see, Saul replies, you are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man and he is a warrior from his youth. So, these words of discouragement did not bother or did not intersect in David's life. See, it was like Saul quenching out David's fire with his words, but David was very, very, very strong in his decision. You see, even today we might be like David with a strong faith and boldness, and we too might be bold enough and strong enough in our spiritual journey as we move on daily. And we see those times had passed when we were dull, sad and faithless, etc. But today our faith in God and boldness to face challenges would have increased and developed day by day. So week by week, month by month, and by experience after experience, our faith would have definitely gone up and it still increases in our lives. Ask this question to yourselves: is my faith and boldness still stronger? Even when words of discouragement hits my way, hits me, hits my spiritual journey, and hits my faith and hits my boldness. So is my faith in God and boldness still there even after all? So it is still there, or it has taken other shape and other way? So is our faith and boldness decreasing day by day, or it is still there as it is? Because sometimes the devil comes our way, not necessarily when we are weak. So all the time we hear many words from the preachers as well as we read. We think that the devil will come only when we are weak, only when we are very much dull and we are very sad, but not always. So not necessarily he comes while we are weak, we are helpless and discouraged and fainted, but also he comes and puts such obstacles while we are at the peak of our faith in God, peak in our boldness. So when we examine ourselves, Sometimes we feel that my faith in God is very stronger nowadays, and my boldness to face the challenges have increased, and I can do everything with the help of God. So at that peak of time, sometimes this devil puts up these obstacles in front of us. So peak in the sense, being very much stronger in certain things. So I can do this, I can do that, but suddenly you see a great struggle and a great barrier just comes before us, and just it misleads us or discourages us. So the devil sometimes gives words of discouragement through someone like Saul in our lives. So when we are still confident in our faith in God, through somebody else, through some medium, the devil puts words of discouragement while we are still journeying in the right paths. So the devil would tell you, you are not able to go against that person, you cannot do that, you cannot overcome this, or you cannot defeat anything and fight anyone, and sometimes you are incapable, and most of the times it pushes us to you are nothing. So these many questions the devil puts in our hearts, not when we are weak, but when we are stronger. Just think how to answer such questions asked by Satan. And to know that we must look how David overcame such discouraging words and what all he did. So we need to look carefully the life of David. So today our message is all about how David faced Saul's discouraging words and still kept his faith and boldness alive. And how did Saul look at David? So this is what the message is all about. So the words of Saul and his way of looking at David shows us two important things. So the perspective of Saul looking at David includes the appearance of David, number one. And number two is the age of David. Number one is the appearance of David, and the number two is the age of David. Saul should have encouraged David when David spoke positively among all those Israel. But we see, instead of encouraging David, instead of talking positively to David, Saul failed to encourage him and to motivate that David. In today's message, we are going to look at two important things from the life of David. The first thing is, your appearance doesn't matter to God. So that is the first thing, because Saul saw the appearance of David first. And we see Saul asked that question in verse 33. Saul replied, you are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. So we see the first thing Saul considered was the appearance of David. Saul had seen who Goliath was and how huge he was. So he was a gigantic and powerful person. So we saw about the armors that Goliath, the giant, had, the helmet, the spear that he had on his back, and the guards on his knees and everything. So we have looked at all these things in the previous weeks. So all these things threatened Saul and his armies and the people of Israel. So all the extra fittings of and the war settings of Goliath stirred up the people's heart, and it just brought a great fear among the king of Israel, the armies of the Israel, as well as the common people of Israel. So when David came before Saul, we see Saul did not look David as a warrior. He did not look David as a fighter. When the words of David was heard before Saul, he did not consider David as a winner, as a fighter, as a defender, as an overcomer. But instead of considering that, he considered David as a person who does not have a great appearance like Goliath had. So Saul must have looked up and down, looking at the height of David, the weight of David, the strength that David had. So his physical capacity to fight and defeat that great giant. So you see, according to Saul, David was a handsome youngster. And of course, according to Saul, David was the one who plays beautiful music, who plays very beautiful music. That's why he was sent to the palace of Saul. We see, David was not just handsome, and he was not just a good musician, but he was very much close to God and was filled with the Spirit of God and with the presence of God. So that was the main and most important thing to look at. Saul tells David that you cannot fight this Philistine, this great giant, because he is mightier than you. He is powerful than you. He is taller than you. And he is gigantic than you. So Saul was very much convinced that nobody will ever overcome this great giant, the Goliath, and considered Goliath's appearance too serious. So even a king of Israel had no faith and boldness to overcome such great giant. So he was totally convinced that nobody will ever fight this fellow and win. So David's appearance was nothing before Goliath. As we see, look at the verse very practically. He was shorter than Goliath. Goliath was some 9.5 feet height, and this David was very young, but not that much height taller. So he had no great physical structure as like Goliath had, and while looking at David, we can see only a handsome person, and we cannot see appearance like a fighter. So today, we too might be in the same position like David in our lives. People may not consider us sometimes. They don't believe us. They don't believe our boldness or faith because they look at our appearance. They come to a conclusion that this person cannot do anything because he is physically weak. He is physically not that much powerful. He is not so good looking person. This is what David faced in his life. He was judged by Saul because of his appearance. But the interesting thing in David's life is that even though David was not a great person as like Goliath in appearance, yet he was very much confident in his God. So that his God will help him to defeat that great giant. So only this thing was inside of David. So for God, appearance doesn't matter. For God, appearance doesn't matter. He is able to use anyone with any kind of appearance. Whether you may be tall, short, you may be fat, you may be lean, you may be weak, you may be strong, anything. For God, your appearance doesn't matter. In Saul's eyes, David was a weak person compared to Goliath. But in God's eyes, David was greater than Goliath. So, no matter how our appearance is, our God is able to use us mightily for His glory. Amen. The second thing is, the number one was, your appearance doesn't matter to God. And number two is, your age doesn't matter to God. The second thing Saul considered was David's age. In the life of David, while he was standing in front of Saul, the king of Israel, David was very, very young person. He was not older person, he was very young person. His age was very less and he was a youngster at that time. And we see Saul told, you are only a man, young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth. So we see Saul's focus was on David's age, looking at the age and comparing David's age and Goliath's age. Saul discourages David by telling him directly or indirectly that you are very young to handle this, David, and you need much age to take up things in your hands. And he was like, your age is very less to defeat such a great giant. So, and your age needs huge experience. So you're not that much experienced than that Goliath, and so on. So not only that, Saul tells David that you are just a young man who came just now. You have just now arrived and you don't know what is going to happen or what is happening in this place. Probably you would have heard it from someone else here. And you are new to this fight, to this battle, but look at Goliath. He had been trained as a warrior, not just very frequent or very early. This Goliath was not trained just a week before, a month before, a year before, but he was trained as a warrior from his childhood. So since Goliath's childhood, he was trained as a warrior, a champion. But compared to David, David was tending his father's sheep. He was not used to swords. He was not used to battles, lines, line up, armors, anything. So his age and his experience was entirely different from Goliath. And that is what Saul tells us here. He has been a warrior from his youth, from his childhood, and till now he has been trained for the battle purpose itself. And it was like, hey David, you are not capable of doing things. You cannot do that. So Saul was in the stage of telling all these things indirectly to David. So in a place where the whole Israelites were afraid to face that giant, not even a single elderly person came forward, but this young and this very young David came forward to defeat Goliath. So this young David had a strong faith and boldness to face such a great giant like Goliath. So as these things were not considered by Saul, you see, David was put down by his age. Sometimes people look at age and decide several things for us. So they consider our age and confirm whether we can handle this rightly or not. So age matters to people, but not to God. Sometimes some people look us down because we are very young. We are very young people. So they will look us down and think to themselves that, can he handle these things? So is that girl can handle these many things in this young age? Can that boy, can that brother, or can that sister handle such a great responsibility or such a great obstacle in this very young age? Not possible. So in other cases, we see people will look at the elderly people and think your age is very much. You are very aged and you are older now. So you cannot handle things properly. So in one hand, people judge other people by looking at their age and telling that you are very young to handle this. On the other side, we see the same people just puts discouraging words to us, telling that you are very old to handle several things. So there is always a battle between the other people and a faith and a boldness and everything. So constant discouraging words comes to us very often. So these words will surely hurt us many times. But even in such situations, we as a people of God, what we need to do while people tell all these things to us, you are aged, you cannot handle this. On the other side, you are very young, you cannot handle this. So, as a people of God, we must have stronger faith and boldness like David had. Even after hearing discouraging words from Saul, David was still holding strong to his faith, and he was still brave enough to face the great giant. A faith-filled and a bold person will never allow such discouraging words to enter inside of his heart and mind. So his focus will always be on how to overcome this, how to defeat the obstacles and the struggles in front of us. So he knows that, David knows that when he gives his ears to such words, to such discouraging words, then he knows that he will surely lose his faith and boldness. So as a people of God, we must never feel bad by looking at our own age. So God can use anyone with any age. Age doesn't matter to God. Whether you are 60 plus or 70 plus, 20 plus, 30 plus, 10 plus, but still God is able to use anyone for his glory. So God can use a Sunday school kid wonderfully to reveal his glory. God can use an elderly person wonderfully for his glory. We also see God can use a youngster wonderfully for his glory. So whatever age you are, God still uses us and is still willing to use us greatly. And we see that even after hearing such disappointing and discouraging words from Saul, the king of Israel, David did not lose his faith and boldness till the end. At last, David tells to Saul after this conversation that the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Because we see that David narrates his personal experience to Saul. He tells that once I was tending my sheep, and suddenly a lion came and took up a sheep with its mouth, and I did not go as it is, thinking that it's just a small sheep. I can just get another good sheep. What bothers me if a lion takes only one sheep from my flock? But he was very cautious, and he was very bold enough to fight against that lion and took that sheep from the mouth of the lion, and he tore the mouth of lion, and the lion was killed by David. And we also see another instance. We see a bear. It came and took a sheep from the pen, and David, as like before, he once again risked his life to save a single sheep. So this incident gave a bold faith and a boldness to overcome the great struggles to David. So David tells these things and tells that I faced the lion and a bear face to face, and I tore them apart, and they could have harmed me and tore me apart, but God saved me from those wild animals and from the wild beasts. Who is this fellow that he is defiling the armies of God? The God who saved me from the paws, from the hands of that wild beast, the lion and bear, is able to save me from this Philistine's hand. So he was very bold and he was very confident in God. This is the faith and boldness of David to look at. David was like, come on Goliath, I will surely face you, and my God will give you into my hands. I will surely defeat you. This was the thing would have been running on behind David's mind. So never let anyone or any situation to lose our faith and boldness. That's the most important thing. So no matter how great the challenges are, doesn't matter how the struggles take different forms in our lives. So how worse the struggles are, our God will help us to keep our faith and keep our boldness alive till the end, as like David had. So no matter who puts you down, or who discourages you, or who disappoints you by looking at your appearance and age, remember one thing today, that to our God, our appearance and age doesn't matter at all. So from the life of David, we see the difference between God's way of looking at David and Saul's way of looking at David. In the sight of God, David was, yes, of course, not a great person compared to the physical structure. He was not a warrior. He was not trained for war, this David. His appearance was entirely different from the giant, and his age was also entirely different from giant. But these two things did not bother God to use David mightily. So God's perspective of looking at David and his life was something which we cannot do. So when we look at a person who is very lean and who is very much thin, and we see suddenly a great gigantic person comes and wrestles with him or asks him for a match, for a wrestling match, while looking at that lean fellow and that lean person, we will surely consider him as a loser. So he is going to lose his battle, or he is going to lose his wrestling. So surely that huge fellow is going to crush this fellow. This is what our human minds think. But look at God's perspective. Even though he was not like Goliath, he did not have any armor, anything like Goliath, but God's way of looking at people is entirely different, because Goliath was covered with armor. He was covered with the equipments. He was covered with the helmets. He had a spear, but the worldly things was covering Goliath, but God's presence and God's guidance covered David. So we see in today's context, we see even God's way of looking at us is entirely different from people looking at us. So people might judge us by looking at our appearance. They might mock us. They might comment by looking at the age, appearance. So he is incapable of doing this and that. So I'm sure that he is going to lose his opportunities and everything. But let us all have the Spirit of God in us, as like David had, and he was filled with the Spirit of God always. And that was the reason for David not to lose his faith and boldness even in the tougher times. So even in the challenging times, he clinged on to his boldness and faith. And the title for today's message is, Our Appearance and Age Doesn't Matter to God. Our appearance and age doesn't matter to God. So this is the lesson that maybe it looks like a simple lesson. Appearance and age. So from this simple two things, we can learn a great lesson from the life of David. So whenever you're put to shame, or whenever people tell you that you are incapable, or you're not worthy to handle these things by looking at the appearance and looking at the age, but if you have the Spirit of God and the faith in God and the boldness to face challenges without any doubt, God can use you very wonderfully, that you would have not thought that God would use you like this. So apart from imaginations and apart from expectations, God's way of using people is kind of entirely different and astonishing. We see in the Bible, we see God chose weaker vessels most of the times. So we see many people of God who were used mightily by God. They were initially a weaker vessels. They were initially very young. They were very not so good looking in their appearance. But the Bible tells us that it doesn't matter who you are, who our background is, and what we have gone through, and what all great things we have behind us. But if we have the faith and boldness in God, God will open doors for us to overcome the struggles. So people might wonder, how come this fellow with such a difficult situation is planning to face a great giant in his life? People around us might have all the necessary things in their hands, but yet fear great people in their lives, yet fear great positions in their life, yet fear great threats in their life. But we as a people of God, though we have nothing in our hands, we have no backup in our lives, but only if we have God in our lives, people will just look at our lives and get amused by looking at our lives. So God will do wonders in our life when we surrender ourselves completely to the will of God and keep His words very strongly and believe His words very faithful and have boldness in facing challenges. So this is the thing that this is the lesson that we learned from the life of David, and may God use each and every one of us here. So I see kids seated over here, and we might look at them in a different perspective. We might think that are these kids going to do any great thing by looking at their appearance? So they are very short and they cannot do anything. By looking at the age, considering the age, and we might think that what they are going to do for the kingdom of God or for the society. But God's greatest tools are people who are weak, and people who are very oppressed, and people who are being discouraged by others, and people who are being disrespected by all the other factors. So I believe that the kids who are seated here will be used by God one day. So never lose your hope in God, and never think that my appearance is like this, my age is like this. Because for God, age doesn't matter, and for God, your appearance doesn't matter. So may God bless each and every one of us.